This is Judaism Unbound, Episode 17, Intermarriage, a Fact of 21st Century Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
So we're here now for the concluding episode of our Intermarriage, the New Normal series. We talked 2 weeks ago with Karen McGinnity and last week with Paul Golan. And we really started wrapping our minds around the issue of intermarriage in 21st century American Judaism. Now, before we get into the details of that, I wanted to say a couple of things to our listeners. Number one is just to make sure that people know that at our website, JudaismUnbound.com, we have show notes, extensive show notes for every episode. And it's something we really try to put together so that people can really find all the links to things that we talk about in the show and things that our guests have written. And I think it's especially interesting to point that out today because tonight starts the holiday of Shavuot, which is a holiday that a lot of Jews don't really know much about. The holiday of Shavuot started out as an agricultural festival where the first fruits would be brought to the temple, but in Rabbinic Judaism, it became a kind of reenactment holiday, reenacting the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And one of the traditional ways of observing the holiday is to stay up all night long studying Torah. So in a sort of 21st century version for people, especially who aren't parts of Jewish communities where they have that practice, we put together a web page at our site that is going to allow people to use our first 17 episodes, including this one, as a way of walking themselves through some kind of deep study, deep thinking about Judaism. So we're really excited that that's available now. So looking back on the issues of intermarriage that we've discussed, I mean, I guess the thing that's been in my mind since we've been having these conversations is really just kind of a recognition that whereas I felt like when I was growing up in a kind of traditional Jewish community, there was some notion that kind of intermarriage was not a good choice for people, some notion like bad choices, don't do it. It feels to me like the reality of American Jewish life today is that it's simply a fact of Jewish life. And that's why we've called this episode Intermarriage, a Fact of 21st Century Judaism, and why we've called this series Intermarriage, the New Normal. It basically seems to me that it's an accurate description of American Jews today, if not the organized American Jewish community, but of American Jews today, that the fact that they are going to be intermarrying is simply a reality in most cases, in many cases, let's say, and that what is really a helpful way of thinking about it that we don't hear a lot in the Jewish community is let's take that as a given. And now let's ask ourselves, what does Judaism look like given that thing? So let me just recount one story that I had recently. I'm on the youth education board of my synagogue, which I think, as I've said before, I'm not a particularly frequently attending member of, but nevertheless, they put me on these kind of committees, and I try to be as helpful as I can. And we were sitting around and talking about what kinds of educational activities we should be doing for our youth. And one of the things that I said was, look, I think that we have to accept as a reality that the majority of our children are going to marry somebody who's not Jewish. And given that, the question is, what kind of education should we be providing children so that they will make Judaism an important part of their lives, an important part of their children's lives, given the fact that they will be married to somebody who's not Jewish. And actually thinking about our conversation with Karen McGinnity, if it seems to be the case based on the research that children of Jewish women who intermarry are more likely to identify Jewishly than children of men who intermarry, and that the reason for that is because even in 21st century America, it's still often the woman who sort of establishes the basic family activities and family commitments, that it would therefore be an important thing for Jewish continuity, let's say, to educate men in such a way that would say, no, Jewish men, you should take responsibility or equal responsibility with your wives for the way that the family is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one piece that we talked about with Paul that I think is really important is that he spoke about the extent to which these conversations about intermarriage have to confront the question of race also, because the second you have intermarriage, it's not just that Jews are intermarrying with white people who aren't Jewish. It's that Jews are intermarrying with people who aren't Jewish that are white, that are African American, that are of Asian descent, that are from all over the place. And what that means for our communities is a whole slew of new questions that we haven't totally gotten used to yet. And that's where, so I of course agree that intermarriage is the new normal, but I think that there's a difference between sort of knowing intellectually that intermarriage is a fact of life and really deep down feeling it fully. So as an example, we talked about with Paul the idea of looking Jewish. So we still have this conception that certain people look Jewish, white, brown hair, often curly, the noses are a certain way.
Like me.
We have that conception. Right. Yeah. I mean, and I actually, by many measures of that stereotypical idea, I do myself look Jewish. So part of me likes the idea that I can walk around and see people and have a sense that they're Jewish or not. But the huge baggage of that is that in this age, it's actually just not true. It actually just doesn't work. And a growing percentage of Jewish human beings don't fit that mold. And if we sort of opt to see those who do fit that mold as normal and the rest as atypical, we are selling Judaism short. We're implying that Judaism is this narrow thing, which I think would be a major bummer because Judaism can be so much broader and more beautiful than that. The other piece is that we think about Jewish names. We talk about Jewish last names or even first names that might stem from the Bible. And what we heard both in our conversation with Karen McGinnity and what I've experienced with others is that people have a lot of assumptions based on last names that are just no longer true. A friend of mine, his last name is Fitzgerald, is the president of Hillel at my alma mater. That's maybe something new. Maybe it's not so new. We've always had Jews by choice who might have different last names, but it's something that we need to think about, especially in a world where, we make jokes about Rosenblatt, Goldberg, those kinds of names that we think of as, once again, normal, and other kinds of names as atypical.
Yeah, and I guess that actually brings up a thing, another thing that I've been thinking about, which is this question of what is the goal here? There's a number of layers to the question of what is the goal. One thing that Paul brought up a lot, which I think is absolutely right, is that intermarriage, in a way, you could think of it as sort of a canary in the coal mine issue, that it's actually not the main issue in a lot of ways. The main issue is the Jewish community is not the same as Jews. And I think that, one of the things that occurs to me in these conversations is that a lot of the questions that the organized Jewish community is sort of pulling its hair out about, whether that is the question of intermarriage itself or the question of how we should relate to people that are intermarried or their spouses or their children, those are not questions that the people are asking themselves. Those are questions that have long been answered by the vast majority of Jews, which is that, of course, I should be able to marry whoever I love. And of course, anybody who cares about me should accept the person I love. And of course, I can be Jewish even though I'm married to somebody who's not Jewish, because what does that have to do with my Judaism at all, right? I mean, these are questions that I feel like the vast majority of Jews are not asking. And so I think that you actually see this incredible mismatch between the Jews and the Jewish, quote, leadership.
And part of that is that as much as the Jews, as you put it, have shifted on this question of intermarriage, leadership, which is the last word you mentioned, so those who are in elected, appointed positions in the Jewish community aren't as reflective of those broader numbers that we see. And so we have an issue where it's far less likely that those in leadership of a local Jewish federation or of a synagogue or of a JCC are intermarried themselves than somebody who they are supposed to be serving. So we've got an issue in general, and this is actually relates to something that Big Tent Judaism came out recently with this glass ceiling idea.
There was a report that they issued.
Right. And I think that that's really crucial because when, and Paul alluded to this, or it's not even just on intermarriage. We've talked to a number of people who have spoken about how it's important that whatever cause you're working on sort of helps you. So when we talked to, we've got some upcoming episodes coming up with people from Moishe House and otherwise, and they talked about how a large reason why they succeed is that they're serving themselves. They're helping fix a problem that affects their own lives. And so if in the Jewish community, the capital C, quote unquote community, we start to see a push towards incorporation of those who are intermarried, then that stuff might change. Now, this brings up the question you just discussed, which is, does what the leaders do determine what the community is? And that's a bigger question.
Well, I think that we really need to get into this question of leadership because, I really think leadership is probably the wrong word in a lot of what we're talking about. Because, first of all, I think in classic leadership studies, you talk about, a leader is someone who has followers. So if you don't have followers, then I'm not really sure you're a leader. Now, I think a lot of Jewish, quote, leaders do have followers. It's just that their followers are a different set of people than I think they often identify as their followers or talk about as their followers, meaning that somebody who is the leader, let's say, of a Jewish federation may well be only the leader of the people that see themselves as affiliated with that federation. But often they talk about themselves as leaders of the Jews of their city, or in the case of the National Federation, nationally. Now, not everybody does, and I think a lot of people are trying to wrap their minds around this. And earlier in American Jewish history, it might have been more correct to say that in some way those positions reflected a true leadership position of a much wider community. But today, I don't think that that's really true, and nevertheless, the language is set that way. And I think that has a lot of bad effects on people who see themselves as excluded from the Jewish community for one reason or another, and not only people that are intermarried, but all sorts of people that are excluded for various reasons. And there's a classic story in the Torah about this, where the spies or the scouts are sent into the promised land, and they go and they explore the land of Canaan, and they see these giants that live there. And one of the things that happens is they come back and they report to Moses, we saw these giants there, and they saw us as grasshoppers, and we saw ourselves as grasshoppers. Because they imagined that the giants saw them as grasshoppers, they then imagined themselves as grasshoppers. And, we know this kind of thing. It's classic. This is exactly what Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated, or that began the process of desegregating American schools, really looked at some of the social science evidence about how African-American kids preferred to play with the white dolls, because they had been conditioned to kind of see that as the best way to be, and so this idea that people see themselves in the way that society sees them is an old story, but I think that part of the problem is that if people who are dissenters from the way Judaism is presented by various Jewish institutions, if they don't understand themselves to be dissenters, but they just understand themselves to be, quote, bad Jews, then they're going to see themselves in this sort of inferior status. And I worry that there are two problems with that. Number one is the problem of simply feeling terrible and feeling excluded. But the other is about the strategy that brings up as to how I might feel included, right? Because it tends to put me in the mindset that says the only way that I can feel included is if I can convince those powerful others to include me, as opposed to saying the way that I'm going to feel included is to create my own community that is built around my needs and my values. And so I thought one of the things that came up in the conversation with Paul that I think is really absolutely right, that I want to hammer home, is that, it's not that intermarriage is a symptom, because it's not, in my view, a problem. But the point is that it is an outgrowth of something else, right? Intermarriage is not, quote, the problem. Intermarriage is an outgrowth of a larger change in reality. And it might be interesting to talk through why we don't accept this trope that intermarriage is a bad thing, right? Now, again, I want to take this from two different directions. One is from the perspective of the organized, existing, institutionalized Jewish community. And the second is sort of from a larger picture of the Jews. As far as the organized Jewish community goes, I guess it's important to start by trying to understand where the concern about intermarriage stems from. I think you have to go back to a period of time where the Jews lived in shtetls of Eastern Europe. Again, we've talked about Ashken normativity and such, so we know that this isn't true of all the Jews, but just in terms of the dominant American Jewish perspective. And it seems like at that time, there was very little chance that a Jewish man would marry a non-Jewish woman, because it's quite likely that the parents of the non-Jewish woman wouldn't permit that. And in terms of a Jewish woman marrying a non-Jewish man in those times, you have to imagine that would mean likely that the Jewish woman is going to sort of be leaving Judaism and going on to live in a non-Jewish society. I think that was the general reality of Jewish life in Eastern Europe in the sort of Middle Ages and the early modern period. And so you have a community that has a basically extremely negative view of intermarriage. And I actually think that a lot of the Jewish ideas of like what you shouldn't do sometimes come from, what I call the, if the club wouldn't want to have me as a member, I wouldn't want to be a member sort of mentality, So it's like if the non-Jews are not wanting to marry us, then we're going to establish as a strong value that like we wouldn't want to marry them anyway, and that starts to become culturally ingrained, and sort of like many things, you start to just do these things because we've always done them, and you're not really thinking that much about them anymore, right? So I think that when the Jews come to America, there's this strong sense that intermarriage is a bad thing, and then it gets sort of another layer gets added onto it, which is the understanding that America is a very free kind of society, and that anything that makes people sort of less obligated in different ways to being part of the Jewish communities, the structure of the Jewish communities, is a dangerous thing. The question is basically, what can we say to the person who says, look, I look out at the world around me and I see that people who are intermarried, most of them are not really seriously connected to the Jewish world anymore, and therefore that's why I think it's such a bad thing. I mean, what is the answer to that?
My answer to that is that I would first acknowledge that is often true. It's impossible to say with any credibility that all or the vast majority of Jews in intermarriages are finding ways to be deeply immersed in traditional paradigms of Judaism. So noting to start that there is some amount of truth there. What I would then say is that's shifting, and I think it's shifting very quickly. And I don't necessarily know why, but I definitely know among people my age, and this includes me, because as I've mentioned on the show, I'm in an interfaith relationship. I don't like interfaith. I'm in a relationship with somebody who isn't Jewish, whose faith is actually very similar to mine in many ways. So I think that for those who are Jewish and deeply connected, the extent of a departure from Judaism that intermarriage constitutes in their minds is smaller than it once was. It doesn't feel like I'm leaving anything when I come home from work and my non-Jewish girlfriend is there. It doesn't. And
in part, I think that's because in America today, right? And I think this is really important for people to understand. People know this, I think, but it hasn't sunk in a deep way, right? Is that in general, I thought Paul Golan was really helpful in focusing us on you got to be paying attention to what is happening in the rest of society. And one of the things is that in America today, it's not any part of people's lives to say, like, I am this one thing dominantly and that's all I do, right? There's this idea of people having multiple interests, multiple passions, shifting passions, right? That's just what it is to be an American, particularly a millennial American today, right? So I think that one of the reasons seems to me that it's less likely that Jews would see intermarriage as like something that's going to make them step away from the Jewish community is because they're not thinking in binary terms in the way that the same person in the 1950s, let's say, might have just simply been conditioned to think in binary terms. So if I'm marrying someone that's not Jewish, and especially if they're very connected to their non-Jewish family or practice, then I guess I'm going to have to make the choice to be functionally not very Jewish. Whereas today it's like, oh, sure, you want to do this, and you want, you want to go, we'll go here for Christmas and go here for Hanukkah, we'll go here for Passover and here for Easter. That would be fine. That's really interesting. Even more stuff to do. I think it's sort of a common sense that people have.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely not an either or generation, and an American society, forgetting generations, I think has become not much of an either or kind of landscape. So that's definitely true. And the other piece, more and more, I meet people who aren't Jewish who are fascinated by Judaism. And by the way, that fascination doesn't mean they want to be Jewish. That's important. Because often I get this little twinkle in the eye of the person I'm talking to when I say, oh, my girlfriend really enjoys a lot of things about Judaism, and she enjoys going to services with me. And I say all of these things because they're true, and I do care about those things. And then I get this twinkle in the eye, and they're like, oh, I bet she's going to convert one day. No, not only is it not true in her case, I think in general, that whole idea that, oh, if you feel an affinity for something, you are therefore going to join it, is not how people my age think. This gets at, when I ask people about their Jewish practice, I've learned that asking what denomination are you is a totally ineffective question. Because most people I know that are deeply connected Jewishly that are around my age don't feel comfortable saying one denomination or another. This is the majority of my friends that are on like a deep level of engagement. They're not conservative, they're not Reformed, they're not Orthodox. They are a person who keeps kosher, but only when they're out of the house or only when they're inside. Like they answer in terms of the specific things they do as opposed to the groups they affiliate with. So we think much more about how to sort of fashion our lives. So, what I'm going to do Jewishly for X holiday, for Y ritual, and those kinds of things you can do whether you're Jewish or not. And so I do all of those things with my non-Jewish girlfriend. And I actually get a lot out of teaching her and learning from her the rituals she grew up with. And I think it inspires me both to connect to my Judaism and also to actually think about, which things in Judaism are worthwhile.
So I think I'm hearing at least two different things from you now. One is that, and I think it's a great point. Again, I think definitely I've had the same kind of twinkle sort of response from people, not about, my family, but, just in thinking about whether someone's going to convert or whatever, and just thinking that, it's not likely that a person's going to convert to Judaism for the same reason that it's not necessarily the case that a person who intermarries is going to drift away from Judaism anymore. It's because that's just not the binary way that people are thinking. So, if somebody might be super interested in Judaism and it might never cross their mind to convert to it, because why should I convert to it? Why do I have to make some declaration that I am now a Jew? Can't I practice Judaism basically in the same way that I practice yoga, which is that it's something that I do, something that I love, something that I actually define a lot of my identity around, but it's not necessarily something that I have to now declare my sole allegiance to. I remember when I was a kid and even in college, I remember people talking about, this question, are you a Jewish American or an American Jew? And I remember in college, it was already kind of getting a lot of pushback, about, but there would be questions like, well, what if Israel and America went to war? Which side would you support? And that kind of question that was fundamentally trying to get at this question of like, what is your dominant identity? And now I think that question is just experienced by millennials and by, I think, older people too, as fundamentally absurd. I have multiple, I'm a Jew, I'm an American, I'm a feminist, I'm a man, I'm a whatever, I'm a this and I'm a that, and I think Anita Diamond listed like 5 or 6 or 7 things that when she's asked, are you a Jewish writer? She said, no, I'm like these 7 things writer, And I thought the other thing that you said was interesting was this idea that not only is it not necessarily a bad thing to marry somebody who's not Jewish, but that actually it could in many cases strengthen somebody's Jewish identity. And I think Karen McGinnity talked about this too, particularly in relation to women, and whether that strengthening of your identity is because you are teaching somebody things that they're not familiar with and it makes you learn stuff that maybe you didn't know, or maybe it's because you feel more motivated to sort of make this connection for your kids because it's not coming easily or it's not natural. And and it requires more effort, and so people put in that effort. I mean, there are various reasons, but, I think it would be an interesting experiment to say, take the same kind of basically non-practicing formally Jew and have them marry a Jew versus have them marry a non-Jew, in which case is Judaism more likely to become a significant, deep part of their lives that they're actually thinking about consciously. It may well be the case of the person who marries the non-Jew.
There's so much there that I agree with. And so there's a few things that come up. First off, we talked about, that experiment. So if a person was somehow able to marry a Jew and a non-Jew, we're not endorsing bigamy, but if there were a hypothetical world where that could happen, and then you could see sort of what would result, that would be interesting for sure. But what that actually does, and I know you didn't mean this, but it implies that marriage is actually the standard and that everybody is doing that. And so we actually, in the 21st century especially, have to think, well, what about for people that even don't marry at all? And like, for me, I can say, we were dating long distance. So for a couple of years, I had a very different relationship than I do now living in the same space. And my Judaism looked different in those two situations, because in one spot I was sort of on my own and sort of involved with whichever community. And now I have a partner. And even though she's not Jewish, I have a partner for my Jewish life. So the other question I would ask is, what do you gain by having a partner at all that you don't have? And what would you gain by being independent and not being married? I mean, there's all sorts of new 21st century questions to wrestle with, because some people aren't even creating families in the ways that they used to. We're talking about intermarriage as if it's the counterpoint to in marriage, but actually there's another option, which is not marrying.
Right. And I think that actually pulls us into an even deeper point, which I don't think we want to get pulled into completely, because I think we want to come back and continue to explore intermarriage in particular in this episode. But one of the things that Paul Golan was talking about, or at least this was what his conversation with us got me in the mind of, was that I think we're often talking about the wrong thing in general when we're talking about Judaism, because we tend to be talking about the present when we should be talking about the future. And it's not to say that the present isn't important. I mean, I think sometimes we talk about the future, or we fret about the future too much, and we don't actually get the value out of the present that we can get. But what I mean is that when we're fretting, we should be fretting about the future and not about the present, because it might be that there's something going on in the present that is causing us a lot of angst, and actually that thing is about to go away and the future is completely different. So Paul in particular was talking about the capacity that, we've talked about this on the show before, that virtual reality, while nascent and early stage today, has the potential. He talked about being able to stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and feel like you're really there, and feel the healing touch of Jesus, and feel like you're actually meditating with the Buddha. And, Paul's question was like, if you could actually have those feelings at that level of sensory perception, why would you want to choose to just be Jewish? You would want to choose all of those things. So maybe what we're really going to have to be dealing with in 25 years in the future is the capacity that people in the deepest possible way will want to be so many different things, because all those experiences will be useful to them. Well, what is it that we're talking about today that even prepares us a little bit for that possibility in the future?
I love that. And the corollary to that is that not only is it true that Jews who have the choice of all those options would choose lots of other options, it's true that people who aren't Jewish, who could choose the Jewish options, are going to do that as well.
Right. And how are we going to relate to those people? Are we gonna call them non-Jews? Are we gonna, I think that a lot of people, for example, and I don't know a ton about this, and it may be in this particular case is problematic, but, I think about all the people who, sort of put down all these celebrities that are studying Kabbalah as like they're just playing around. It's not a real Judaism. Well, again, maybe the Kabbalah stuff is not a real thing. I don't really know a lot about it in depth. But the point is that like if a non-Jew is interested in Jewish stuff, then I think we're going to have to relate to that in a different way than just to say, oh, that's not real Judaism in the future.
What this conversation we're just having implies is that people already are interested in Judaism who are not Jewish. So that's step one. And I mentioned that, I named that because I think we have this weird inferiority complex in the Jewish community where we actually think like, well, why would anybody who's not Jewish want to be Jewish? When Christmas rolls around, even Jon Stewart has had, episodes of his show about this. We'll link to those in the show notes. But it's this classic, we've got Hanukkah. It's just you light some candles and you get socks or whatever, versus Christmas with all the pageantry and everything. And I think that's actually just wrong. Like I talked about why I think Shavuot is like an awesome thing. We have other holidays that have similarly fun rituals historically, or we have still others that we could innovate new rituals. And I think Judaism, in sort of a battle of the isms, does pretty well. I think we have compelling stuff that both Jews and non-Jews, to use a problematic term, are intrigued by. So I think that's actually part of the angst about intermarriage, which is why I bring it up, because I think there's this worry that, if a Christian and a Jew get married, well, Christianity is just going to win because Christianity has all of these perks and it's the dominant narrative in the culture. First off, I know a lot of hipsters who like being different from the rest of society. So on a certain level, many people do actually opt for what is less popular given the choice. That's why we have alternative rock stations. And on another level, I really think that there's so much in Jewish tradition, past and present, that's worthwhile. And that by being so worried about it, we actually perpetuate a narrative of Jewishness as, the space for nerdy Woody Allen types that only get socks on Hanukkah. And like, oh, woe is me, what a bummer of a religion. And the only reason you'd really want to be involved is because your parents were and their parents were and yada, yada. Like, no, I actually think Judaism is this awesome thing.
So I think what you're talking about, Lex, it's worse than a bad narrative. It's actually the potential of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm so fascinated by what you're talking about in terms of, I wasn't even thinking about it in these terms. I think we have a stereotype, as a notion that Judaism can't compete with other religions and other ways of kind of spending your time in America. And, it puts me back in the mind of this question of like, are we talking about Judaism as it, quote, always has been, or are we talking about something else? So I'm thinking about the perspective of, let's say, a European Jewish rabbi in the late 19th century, early 20th century, thinking about the consequences of the Jews coming to America, because there was this fear that Judaism fundamentally couldn't survive America, that the openness of America was something that fundamentally was going to lead people away from Judaism. So number one, the problem is already there, that there's not a belief, a confidence that Judaism is sort of powerful enough to compel participation when you have the choice not to participate. That's pretty sad as a starting point. But the other piece is to say, like, you're framing that you're kind of accepting Judaism as unchanging. You're saying, yeah, look, the form of Judaism that took root in Europe during a time in which Jews were not really free to pursue other possibilities is probably not a form of Judaism that is going to be able to survive America and America's openness. So if you define that as Judaism and you say, is Judaism threatened by America? Is Judaism threatened by intermarriage? Then probably the answer is yes. But the problem is that it doesn't recognize that that's not the definition of Judaism. Now, I think we have to understand, and different people will have different thoughts on this, but what is Judaism? How do we define Judaism? But somehow, I think there's forms of Judaism that can arise in America that fundamentally can survive America, can even thrive in America, specifically because they are compelling and interesting to people in America who have a choice not to do this. I feel like, in a way, the question that's not being asked enough, or the state of affairs that's not being described enough, is that there are all these Jews out there. They're married to non-Jews. They are like Paul, they haven't been to Yom Kippur services in 25 years and they don't really intend to. They're not looking to have expiation for their sins. They don't think that way, right? Nevertheless, they like a lot of things about being Jewish. They're proud to be Jewish, right? But in a deep way, they are profoundly far away from American Jewish institutions, and they're not coming any closer. And my question about them is, can we understand that those people are not asking whether intermarriage is a problem or not. They're taking intermarriage as a given. It is a given. It is merely a fact. When I look at the Jews of America, it feels to me like you either have to say, you know what, we can't figure out how there could possibly be a Judaism that's compelling for Jews that are intermarried to non-Jews. That's a possibility. And I suppose that's fundamentally the outlook of ultra-Orthodox Jews. And the question is whether other liberal denominations, to what extent do they fundamentally see that as the situation? We really can't imagine a Judaism that would be compelling to people that are intermarried. But if somebody is actually compelled by the kind of Judaism that we do and they're intermarried, we'll be more welcoming to them than we used to be. I mean, that feels like in many ways the paradigm that I'm seeing, as opposed to saying, a Judaism that would have to be compelling to Paul, who's intermarried and doesn't go to services on Yom Kippur, that there could be a Judaism that would be compelling to him, but we have to work really, really hard to invent it.
I kind of want to circle back to the topic we were talking about towards the beginning of the episode that we didn't quite delve into about leadership. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious maybe to hear from you. You mentioned that leadership might not be the right word, and I agree, and I have some thoughts on that. But I'm curious if you, Dan, can expand on why the paradigm of leadership might not be as helpful as we think it is, and why.
So I feel like the idea of leadership is fundamentally that there are people that you're leading. If you're in a position of, quote, leadership, but not a lot of people are following you, then I don't really think it's helpful to call that person a leader. And so I guess I'm urging modesty. I guess I'm urging a modest vision of oneself and one's function. There's nothing wrong with being a leader of 25 people or 100 people or, 1,000 people. But if you're a leader of 1,000 people, don't say that you're a leader of 100,000 people. For all we might have issues with him politically, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected by the voting public of Israel. So I think he can legitimately say that he's a leader of Israel. But I'm not sure that somebody who was appointed to their position by a board of an organization can say anything more than they're the leader of that organization. I really don't think there's anybody who can rightfully say that they're a leader of the American Jewish community today. I don't think that the American Jewish community sees itself as having leaders.
I agree with all that. I thought you were going to go a different direction, and I'll go that direction because it's one that I agree with. And just to add on, so you talked about encouraging modesty among people who are the quote-unquote leaders that have these positions. What I worry about as much is the flip side, which is that I worry by using language of leadership and certain people who are Jewish leaders that we're telling people who aren't in those positions that they're not. So it's actually both giving the people in the leadership positions an inflated sense of what their role is, and it's telling people who are not in those positions that, oh, it's not your place. Like, your role is to be a quote unquote follower as opposed to sort of a creator of Judaism. And I see that as a huge issue. And I think you alluded to the idea of rabbis, you and I have talked a little about the title rabbi and why it's interesting that, in almost every field, people just go by their first name, but it's just like doctor and rabbi, that people still are doctor last name or rabbi last name. And that perhaps there are some ramifications of that in terms of both giving rabbis and doctors certain kinds of power. Maybe that's good, maybe in certain ways, but in telling those who lack the title that they aren't permitted to experiment or lead in ways that those others are. So I guess what all this is to say is that I agree 100% with your point that we give these folks an inflated sense of what their role in the Jewish community is when we call them the leaders. But I'm as focused on sort of giving folks who are not the leaders less modesty. I want them to feel empowered to lead or take on roles or inventor type roles that they might not be thinking about. I think what it comes down to for me, you alluded to this, is we've conflated the role of Jewish professional and Jewish representative. Like what you said about Bibi Netanyahu, he is he was elected. He is actually, while he's in an executive role, he can claim to be representing the people who elected him, even those who didn't vote for him, by the way, because that's how elections work. I mean,
right.
Senator of Wisconsin is not senator of the people who voted for him or her,
right.
or them. It's the senator of everyone in that state. So I get that it's not just who supports a person, but the Jewish community has not had any of those kinds of elections for the most part. So when we conflate the idea of Jewish professional with Jewish leader, and those in turn with Jewish representative, we're doing something that's very dangerous, because the second you call yourself a representative and you put forth a policy or whatever that boxes out or tells certain people that they're other, then those Jews don't feel, oh, that organization isn't for me, I'm going to find a different organization. They feel, oh, this representative of the Jewish community says I'm not really fully a part, and therefore I guess Judaism isn't my thing. And that's tragic to me.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting, as you're saying that, I'm remembering that Karen McGinnity talked about how from a gender perspective, men are more likely to have that response of, well, you said that to me, so I'm walking away altogether, whereas women are more likely to, give it another shot. And that's, that's something that we need to be aware of. I mean, it's like, again, I thought that a lot of the gender differences that Karen McGinnity was talking about was a helpful lens, because a lot of times when I hear about gender differences, like, I'm inclined to kind of wish there weren't, and to kind of say, but aren't we a more egalitarian society, or don't we aspire to be a more egalitarian society? And we may well aspire to be, and in our individual lives work to be, but nevertheless, if we close our eyes to the fact that just from a kind of statistical perspective, men will see the same thing differently from women, or, racial minorities will see that something different from people who, like Paul Golan talks about, have born Jewish privilege. We're just not being realistic, and we're not understanding the real world in which we live. And I'd love to see some Jewish realism going on. I'd love to see us saying, let's really understand who the Jews are, and let's really ask ourselves, can there be a Judaism that is compelling to the actual Jews? And if so, how is that going to come about?
Absolutely. I'm excited to carry forth our conversation. And as we do so, there's always a danger when we take on a format with the blocks that we have of, we had American Judaism. Now we're talking about intermarriage. Our next block is loosely new platforms for Jewish identity, Jewish engagement. And there's always a danger when you lay out these blocks of implying that they don't intersect with one another, that, American Judaism was here and intermarriage was here. And I want to remind everyone listening that these conversations about intermarriage are still there as we do our upcoming conversations, because the reality of intermarriage undergirds all of American Jewish life now. And part of where we need to move as a Jewish community is to get past this idea that, oh, we're engaging with intermarriage today and working on inclusion or whatever for the time. And then, next meeting, we're going to do the other thing. Intermarriage actually has to undergird all of the work that we're doing and be something that we're aware of. So I just would mention that as we segue into the next awesome set of podcast episodes that I really think are going to carry us to new places as well.
I feel like there's still aspects of, what's unique about America that I want to explore. There's still aspects of the significance of intermarriage that I want to explore. And what we're trying to do is put all the various things in the mix and keep everything in the mix. And as we go on, things will mix and intermix in different ways. And we really encourage our audience to help us out and suggest ideas, engage in conversation with us. And, in a kind of from a place of humility, I think it's important for us to put out there that we're not self-appointing ourselves as Jewish leaders here. We're just two guys doing the best we can, trying to throw some ideas out and see what kind of conversation they promote.
In that spirit of promoting conversation, we always close out by encouraging our listeners to be in touch with us. And here's a few ways for you to do that. First, you can like our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. We post our episodes there, but we also post a variety of other articles that you might be interested in. We have our website, judaismunbound.com, which features show notes for all of our episodes that has more interesting links for you to check out. And last but not least, we have our emails. So please be in touch with us at lex@nextjewishfuture.org and or dan@nextjewishfuture.org. So with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.